The only hope for young Aussies to own a home, and the Liberals crying spies are the real traitors. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 1st of May 2025. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party Research Director and Senate candidate for Victoria, Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa.
And on today's show, we're going to be talking through our step-by-step program to fix the housing crisis. Very important, and circulate this to young people because there is a pathway out of this problem where prices actually can come down in a manageable way, and we'll show you exactly how that's going to be done. And then we're going to talk secondly about the big scandal that's erupted, albeit completely fabricated, about Chinese foreign influence in the Australian election.
And the people making the accusations are the agents of foreign influence, namely the agents of American foreign influence in Australia. They're the traitors, not the Australian citizens who happen to be of Chinese heritage, who they're calling spies.
And they're just desperately trying to prop up the uni party ahead of tomorrow's election. Now, please help circulate the show. You can hit the like button, make a comment below, circulate on social media, and please consider also making a donation if you can. We've now got to pay everything back that we spent during the election. So we'll have some fun doing that. And of course, we'll be campaigning Monday morning, like usual, even after the election.
That's right. We'll spend Saturday on the polling booth, and we're already on the polling booth because we're covering the pre-polling booths. But we'll spend Saturday on the polling booth because of where we're situated here in Melbourne. We've got a very big campaign in the seat of Corwell, where the candidate is Basima Hawley. So all of our staff are going to be up there helping her. We'll have Sunday off, and then on Monday, straight back into it, because the Citizens Party is all about trying to, influence policy as we go rather than just waiting for elections.
Regardless of whether we're in Parliament or not, or wherever we are.
That's right.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The only hope for young Aussies to own a home. So, this is an ongoing story. It's a very big story for most Australians, whether you be a young person or the parents of a young person.
Well, in economic terms, Elisa, the housing sector is a cancer, the cancer in our economy. Like, our economy tends to roll on and do what it does, but right at the centre of it is this sector that should be about just making sure everyone has shelter, has been turned into a speculative bubble, and it's crushing the next generation. So the households who are raising the young children now, who are going to be the next generation, are suffering an enormous financial burden, whether they're borrowers or renters. And we, as all Australians, have a responsibility to solve this problem.
Now, we've got two major articles in our Australian Alert Service for which you can contact us for a copy of this week. One which outlines the problem, and the other which step by step in point form lays out the solution in an easy to understand format. And look, the leading article points to the shortage of homes from recent reports being around 300,000 homes. But we made the point this is not an unprecedented problem. In fact, that's exactly the figure that in 1943, before the World War II had even ended, John Curtin, Prime Minister, and Ben Chifley, his Finance Minister, called a commission, the Commonwealth Housing Commission, to conduct a survey, and they went to towns all around Australia. They got reams of evidence, and they actually came to the conclusion that the housing shortage was around 300,000 homes.
And therefore it was an even bigger problem because we had there was a 7 million population then.
A quarter of the population
so this
of
is
today.
300,000 home shortage, which is a lot. We're not diminishing it.
No.
But the difference is how they responded compared to how we're responding now.
That's right. But also remember, we had come through a world war. We lost so many of our young men, all of our material, the sorts of supplies that we needed to start a massive home construction program. I mean, nothing was available. Everything had been diverted to the war effort. Now, we have somewhat of a similar situation today, but it's a crisis of our own making this time because we've run down and shut down our economy to such a degree. And that, of course, really was revealed during COVID because suddenly we couldn't just import what we wanted very easily. But we have not made a concerted effort to solve that and to change that situation. But one of the things that Commonwealth Housing Commission stated, I mean, the primary thing right at the start of the final report of that inquiry was that a dwelling of good standard is the right of every citizen. And that was what propelled the program that Curtin and Chifley presented and laid out. But the key element at the same time was the funding of it, which we'll come to in a moment when we discuss the solutions. But just to go a little bit more into the problem as laid out in this article written by Richard Barden in the Australian Alert Service and the flawed solutions that are coming from Labor and Liberal. Of course, their solutions always revolve around more of the same because they're constricted to stay within the neoliberal economic framework that says you have to leave everything to the market, and therefore they just propose various initiatives that help get people into the housing market, which help continue to inflate the bubble and protect the banks.
Well, it's even wrong to characterise, like I would characterise it differently. What you just said is helping people get into the housing market. I characterise as helping the banks lend for another mortgage.
Yes, that's true.
So
that's the primary thing.
The banks created this problem. The banks in league with the government. The banks refuse to let anyone solve the problem because they make so much profit out of housing, out of making housing unaffordable for the rest of us. So every time both major parties come up with solutions, every single time, without fail, it's about helping the banks lend more money for housing. So they can make more profits, and they don't care if you go from being rental stressed to mortgage stressed. They don't give a stuff about you. They've helped the banks. And that's what it comes down to. And
so just in reference to the economy and what we've done to the economy, this has all made it worse because an AFR article that came out last month was talking about, the cost blowouts, delays, shortages, things like higher interest rates that are feeding an economic environment, which has led to the collapse just within 12 months of more than 2,300 construction companies. So, you're not on the pathway to solving the crisis of building those 300,000 lacking homes in that economic framework. And then you have, of course, the pledge to lower immigration by particularly the Liberal Party, even though at the same time they say we'll ensure we have the skills necessary because we have a shortage of skills. And again, that comes to long-term policies regarding education and training and so forth, which we've gone on about for decades in our political party. And then other things that are raised, such as the parties are suggesting banning foreign investment, which turns out to be a furphy because when the Labor Party discussed it, in one breath they said we're going to ban foreign investors, and then in the next breath they said foreign investors are in fact already banned from buying established property anyway, quote, except in limited circumstances such as when they come to live here for work or for study. And that's been echoed by the Liberal Party as well. But in fact, in 1 year, from 2022 to 23, the number of home purchases by foreign investors was 5,350 total, which is fewer than sold on one busy weekend. And then you have to take off 1,119 homes which were offloaded in that same year. So it's not the primary problem. All these things that they're addressing.
It's less than 2% of the market. And this is quite important, and we'll elaborate on this a little bit more when we go through the solutions. But to solve the problem, you got to know what the problem isn't. And a lot of viewers right now would have been assuming that immigration and foreign buying of homes is the big problem. It is not. We will explain what the big problem is. But this is easy for political charlatans to try and distract you from what the big problem actually is. And what it does, and it can lead to some social dangers where people start resenting their neighbour from another country, right? As all these immigrants are buying everything up. Those are the figures, right? Less than 2% of the market is foreign buyers, and that is the reality. Now, there's lots of immigration where people are becoming Australian citizens, and therefore they have exactly the same rights as us, right? As the rest of us. All citizens have the same rights, but they're no longer foreign buyers. And this is the part that people have to be really clear on, because if you get distracted by this foreign buyer narrative, you're not going to solve the problem, because you're not going to go after the real cause, which we'll explain in a second.
Yeah, and we'll go through the solutions now, because that question of immigration is, we'll talk about the details of that, because we're cramming people into too few cities, and that's a bigger part of the problem. But yeah, let's just go through this summary that you put together of the ACP's program, starting with, there's 5 areas: defining the problem, identifying the cause, ending the policies pushing up house prices, expanding housing supply Australia-wide, and finally managing households and banks through the transition, because what we're proposing here is going to bring down house prices.
Yep.
And of course that's going to affect a lot of people who already own their home.
So the first thing, Elisa, is number one is define the problem. And it's a very basic definition. House prices are too expensive. That's it.
That's the problem.
That is the problem. There is no, but that's a controversial way to define it, because you know what that means. They have to come down.
Yes.
And every boomer watching has just had a heart attack. But it's not real anyway. Like this is something that's psychological. I can remember, Christmas lunches 15 years ago, hanging out with boomers and having schizophrenic conversations where, on the one hand, literally bragging about how much their homes are worth, and on the other hand, then expressing real regret that their kids can't afford to buy a home. So if you like being told by a real estate agent, hey, your house, it's worth $1.5 million, $1.5 million, or $2 million, or $2.5 million. It's like, oh wow, look, I'm secure. Well, go and realise that money. Sell your house, and then where are you going to live? And you're going to spend all that money, if not more, buying somewhere else to live. So it's a relative value. It's not an absolute value. It's not a real value. And therefore, if there's a way to bring house prices down for everybody so that young people can afford them, that is what we need to aim for. And this is the thing. House prices are too expensive. We'll put up this graph, Elisa, which shows that this is a fundamental cause of the problem. But what this graph shows is, you can see there the big jump from 2000 to 2003. House prices have not just become too expensive in the last few years. They've been too expensive since the early 2000s, right? It's only got worse since then, but the fundamental cause was that. And essentially the way you define it as being too expensive is, historically, look how flat that line was, going back to 1990, and you can take that all the way back to Federation. Historically, houses were 3 to 4 times household income. And when certain changes were made, which we'll talk about next, that shot up to, on average, 8 times across the country, 10 times in Melbourne, 15 times in Sydney, right? And Brisbane is Brisbane's now more expensive than Melbourne, so it's probably 11 times or whatever in Brisbane. But the average across the country is 8 times. But given that the historical average was 3 to 4 times, that's how you know house prices are too expensive. Relative to incomes, house prices are too expensive. That's the problem.
All right, so let's identify the cause more explicitly. You've mentioned and hinted at a few things.
Okay, so back to what we said about immigration not being the cause. Now, we've given the figures why the foreign buying is not the cause. Also, what we're about, that graph, we'll keep it on the screen, you didn't have a big burst in immigration in Australia in those years. The big burst in immigration in Australia didn't come until 2007, when they were scrambling in response to the 2008, in response to the global financial crisis. So look at the explosion of house prices. What caused that, right? Now, we're not trying to be Pollyanna here and pretend that immigration can never have any impact. What immigration can do is add more pressure onto an existing problem, but it is not the cause of the problem. So I understand the difference there. So what caused that? Well, three things essentially, three main things and then a few others. We'll just go through them. Fundamentally, in 1998, this had far-reaching consequences. At the request of the Reserve Bank, and I understand the Howard government, the Australian Bureau of Statistics took land out of the calculation of inflation, called the CPI. And when they removed land, that meant, there hadn't been a house price growth increase then, but when a couple of years later house prices started going up, it didn't register in inflation. And because it didn't register in inflation, everyone remember the dot-com bubble? There was a mini global financial crisis in around 2000, 2001 when the dot-com bubble burst, and the way central banks around the world responded to it, they dropped interest rates. But in Australia, the Reserve Bank was dropping interest rates while house prices were exploding. Yet their rule, remember, that we've all been dealing with, very conscious of in the last few years, is as inflation goes up, they've got to raise interest rates. But they had taken the most important ingredient out of inflation, and so they didn't have to. And they were fueling the increase the more they dropped interest rates. That had far-reaching consequences. So taking land out of inflation, very important. The second thing, and this had the most far-reaching consequences, in 1999, Peter Costello introduced a 50% discount on the capital gains tax. Now, what that did was make housing an investment, a very attractive investment opportunity, and the banks started lining up housing investors to pour money into the housing market with an advantage over home buyers, and all this extra money coming from speculators essentially just drove in a massive way this spike on that graph. That's where it came from. All this extra money coming into the market from people who didn't want homes for themselves
to live in. Yeah,
they just wanted to speculate
sell
on them,
make
right?
a profit.
And at first they might have thought, for the first year, they might have thought, I want to buy a home and I'm going to get renters in there and they'll cover the costs. But as the house prices kept going up so fast, then the mentality changed like this. It was, hang on, I don't even have to rent it out.
Which is a hassle anyway,
right?
to do.
I can buy it this now, and 6 months later I'll flip it, right? Or 12 months later I'll flip it, and it's going to be worth $50,000 more, $100,000 more. I mean, talk about easy money, right? And the banks are throwing money at these people. I can remember a current affair doing what now in retrospect was absolutely ludicrous stories of the people who owned 100 homes. And then they would be honest and say, well, but the bank actually owns them, right? The bank would lend to someone, one person, to buy 100 homes, right? This is the kind of insanity that was going on at the time. So that was very, very consequential. And then the other one that was also very consequential was in 2001, John Howard introduced for the first time, the first home buyers grant, which was $7,000. But for all the first home buyers, because this was his way of balancing the fact they were being priced out by investors, but for all those first home buyers, they all lined up to get the grant. And what did that mean? Billions of taxpayers' dollars, government money, extra went into the housing market, right? And all that, it just increased the demand even more, and that's where that came from. Now,
so we've also got APRA's prudential regulations.
These are the sort of things that this is for nerds, but we've got a super nerd on our side. Professor Andy Schmulo knows this stuff backwards. He's the only person with a doctorate in prudential regulation, bank prudential regulation in Australia, and he's our candidate for Senate in New South Wales.
You don't need to understand this.
He knows this stuff backwards, but just to make it quite simple,
yeah.
Essentially APRA has rules about when banks lend money, they have to hold a certain amount of capital against those loans in case some of them go bad. They allow the banks to hold against mortgages a tiny amount of capital, much smaller than every other loan they make. And that makes the mortgage lending the most profitable things banks can do. And that's why we have that graph, which we can put up now, where over time, the proportion of lending from the major banks in Australia has gone from 30% roughly to mortgages and 70% to business. It flipped, and now it's the opposite. It's 70% around that to mortgages and 30% to business, and they're just creaming it because there's so much. And the bigger the mortgage, the more the house prices went up, the bigger the mortgages got that the banks could lend, right? And the more profit they make out of that. And that's why they're the most profitable banks in the world, and you can't afford to live in a house.
Yeah, and meanwhile, small business and entrepreneurs are finding it hard to get a loan.
And the other thing, Elisa,
things.
that's right, and just the other one in terms of the cause, because we have to identify this because it's part of we'll talk about the solution, is preceding this, generally over a couple of decades, there was this sell-off, mainly by the states, in public housing stock.
And this was, just to note, actually because the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement that I spoke about was being dismantled and run down by Menzies, and he started to cut the funding to it and said to the states, well, if you need more money, sell the public homes you've already built so that you can build more. So the stock was run down and the whole production of new public housing ground to a halt.
And they essentially privatised what was left.
Yeah.
And but what happened when you had a big public housing sector, right? The housing. I mean, my grandmother, who was a legacy war widow, in Stawell. I remember, every time I visited her, she was in this very lovely housing commission home, right? She lived there the whole time I knew her, until she had to go into a nursing home. This stock of housing meant that the bottom end of the market, there was reduced demand because the poorest, the people on the lowest income households, and things like the widows and single elderly women, who are now the biggest risk of homelessness in Australia because they're retiring without enough money to live on, right? And these poor, desperate women especially are really desperate and they've got nowhere they can afford to live. That was all taken care of by this public housing. And by keeping the demand at that end down, right, there wasn't demand in the private housing market or the private rental market, that was a dampening effect on the overall market. It stopped it overheating. And that was always a good thing. And by getting rid of that, that just allowed all these other things to just have no hindrance as it took off.
Now, all those factors that you've just addressed as the causality of our housing being too expensive, we have policies to address them all. So just very simply phasing out the capital gains tax discount, adding land back into the inflation index, ending the kinds of first home buyers grants.
And exactly the policies that Dutton and Albanese announced the other day. That's all got to go. Anything that allows the banks to lend more money. These are all the artificial props that are pushing up the housing market. Take them all away.
And changing the APRA
prudential
regulations. All those things are very straightforward things to do. So that's all part of
they were the causes of it. Take them all away. And immediately the housing market will have to adjust. If that is not all pushing it up again, it will have to adjust.
Okay, now how to expand housing supply in Australia is the next point in our policy program.
Well, this is somewhat your area because you've done you did the history research on this. So it starts with the public bank.
Yes. So this is what I talked about earlier, where we had this inquiry in 1943, and then the report was issued by the Commonwealth Housing Commission, in which the proposal was for the federal and state governments to work together with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, providing the funding. Where each state would have a housing authority, and they had extraordinary powers. They could direct local government as well, top down. So it was a collaborative effort, which took a lot of doing, as you can imagine it would today. But nonetheless, they did it because this was a huge challenge. At the end of a war, you had returning servicemen, you had war widows and so forth, and so it had to be done. And they built 100,000 homes within a decade, and there were more homes built besides that, in fact, because it spurred building of private homes as well, because
that's
they
right.
transformed the economy. And so within 5 years, 1945 to 1950, nearly 200,000 homes were actually
So what
built.
happened? So you got a 300,000. They identify a 300,000 home shortage.
Yep.
The government builds 100,000 itself.
Yep.
The private sector, because there's all this
Builds more.
stimulation, builds more. Now, can I say, think about what you just said to the viewer. Think about what Elisa just said, because when you hear the debates on Q&A, etc., about housing, you always have these shills for the real estate industry say the biggest problem is the planning and the requirements, right? Where the bureaucracy of down to local government level of doing this stuff. Well, so how come they didn't have that problem then? Now they could have had that problem, but the way the federal government overcame it, because the federal government can't dictate to the states, but the states can dictate to the councils, because councils come under the authority of the states. So the federal government got its authority over the system by providing the money, using the Commonwealth Bank. So the federal government said to the states, we'll come to the table with the money, you provide the authority to make this happen. And so you then had very amenable states and local governments saying, yep, let's make this happen, because the federal government was providing the money. That's why the essence of our policy is so important. We have a public bank. We'll go back to that model. We'll set up a national housing authority, and that will do exactly the same thing with the states and local government again, right?
Yep.
And if the feds are providing the money, they're going to want to do it. And suddenly watch the red tape disappear to make this happen. But the feds don't do this now because they don't want to come up with the money, because it comes out of the budget, because they are too scared to stand up to the banks to start their own bank, where they won't have to get it from the budget.
Yep. So what happened with the CSHA is that the Commonwealth Bank provided the money in exchange for treasury bills that the government drew up, and that was the credit. That was the credit that was spent, and they knew it wouldn't be inflationary because they put it into building the housing for people and the infrastructure that went with it, and the agencies, as you pointed out. I mean, if you look at that CSHA report, I mean, it's extremely detailed, not just about building the necessary sewage systems and other infrastructure, but community facilities, cultural facilities, all those sorts of things. But gradually over time, as I mentioned before, Menzies began to dismantle this, and the whole post-World War II early stage of neoliberalism advocated against national credit. And so we started to say, okay, we're just going to float bonds on the open market and people can buy them. We're not going to use government-backed credit any longer. And that's led us to a situation where we are today, where we, just rule that out as an option. But I did want to point to an agency, before we come back to our policy, that we have today, Housing Australia, which does have the capacity to act as a bank to issue government-backed bonds as a form of lending to state government and other agencies such as community housing providers that build social and affordable housing projects, and mostly charitable and church type organisations.
Yep.
So Housing Australia gets funding from the government, and it also operates to extend these loans using the Affordable Housing Bond Aggregator, and that's the agency which issues government guaranteed bonds, and it actually has the power, as the CSHA did, to direct lending through state governments, through community housing providers and developers to build and acquire new homes. But it's not at scale. It's built fewer than 19,000 homes it's only existed for 7 years. It completed 367 homes in 2023 to 24, new homes, and finished off another 1,700 which were already under construction. But what I'm saying is you could use an agency like this. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It just needs to be directed in terms of the volume of credit and the volume of building that it could be done, to be scaled up to do this on a much bigger scale.
Look, this is the difference between us and, say, the current Labor government. We have revived their party's historical policies, but they are such mental pygmies. Everything they do is tiny. So they have all these little institutions, all of which could function as equivalent of a development bank to do this stuff. But they're so tiny, right? And what they need to be is massively scaled up. And like the National Reconstruction Fund could be a development bank. It's a $15 billion fund. If it was a bank, it could be putting out $150 billion a year in credit, which gets paid back, and they make a profit on it. It does more. But no, it's just a fund. This does it through this borrowing mechanism. It could scale it up, right? So it's all there to do, but you need leadership to do it. And why don't they do it? Because the banks don't want them encroaching on their territory. So we have to change that. Now, Elisa, back to the actual bullet points. We make some important points here about we don't want the assumption to be just solving the housing problem in the big cities, right? One way to solve the housing problem is stop thinking about the big cities, think about the whole country as a whole. And so when you have the bank, if the bank is the foundation of this, it's also it is a development bank. And as a development bank, it can be lending into some visionary infrastructure, such as, imagine a high-speed railway network that, just for starters, starts from Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Wollongong, down to Melbourne, Newcastle before Sydney, right? Down to Melbourne, around to Adelaide, just for starters, and then over time, expand that, but also look at each state as a whole and say, okay, take Melbourne. There's been a proposal in the book for a few decades to have high-speed rail from Melbourne to Geelong, to Ballarat, to Bendigo, to Shepparton, and to Traralgon. There's like this spokes thing. And I mean real high-speed rail. The minute you do that, if you have that kind of infrastructure, all those regional cities become a viable part of the major city, right? And the people can have many more options to live in. Plus, don't just do it for infrastructure, invest in industry so that you take that viability of these regional areas way beyond that, so that you can have thriving industries right across Australia that attract people to want to live in those places. So what you then can achieve is a system where population growth, as it happens, is evenly distributed across the whole country. And if it's evenly distributed, you're not going to have this crowding phenomenon, which does happen.
Where you can't even get down the streets in some of the areas of this part of Melbourne.
These northern suburbs here, it's not that the population has just exploded in Australia, it's exploded in a tiny area, right? And that includes the electorate of Calwell. So that's an important part of it. Also, you mentioned it a second ago, but I just wanted to be clear. The bank could also recruit private developers who do know how to develop. They take a big plot of land, right, and they know they've got to put in all the infrastructure, etc. But some of them have come to me and explain how difficult this is, and this difficulty of jumping through the 3 levels of bureaucracy, red tape, right? So with our system, where it's done top down through the federal government providing the money, the bank could also outsource the actual construction phase of this to private developers who can do this, who will be able to do some of this stuff quite efficiently. Still have a public developer, but have private developers as well to build the kind of housing in these areas. And that's how you can do this kind of stuff rapidly. And then a third element to make it rapid is, people might be familiar with this, but there's a trend now of housing, which is like, what do they, the shipping containers, right? But
tiny homes.
Well, but you can add a few together, and then they're not so tiny homes, right? And they can make, but let's go beyond that. I noticed this week, I didn't get to watch the show, but SBS was advertising a show about Swedish modular homes. And the Chinese also build these modular homes. These are prefabricated modular homes. That we have this challenge of building a lot of homes fast, a lot of good homes fast, but construction is so expensive at the moment. So what we could do and what we should do is have trade arrangements with these countries. And if Sweden is a leader, and China is definitely a leader in this, go to China and say, let's have a trade arrangement. We want to buy a lot of your modular homes. Ship them over here. Now, so this is to prime the pump in a sense, because there's no reason we couldn't be building these modular homes in Australia, right? Where it's not just the size of a shipping container. You put them together and you can have a decent sized home, and you start solving the problem that way. So that would be a massive boost to the challenge of getting a lot of homes built quickly, but which are good homes especially for first home buyers, young families, etc. Good functional homes.
Now, just say we've done all this and we've brought the houses down to something affordable, and maybe you can go and buy a home now for $200,000 or $300,000. Just address the elephant in the room. What if you're the person left with $1 million mortgage and suddenly your house is worth $300,000?
Well, hopefully not $300,000. Don't give them a heart attack. But I tell you what, if there was an actual realistic housing financial crash in Australia, it could go down to $300,000, right? Without us doing anything, because it is such a bubble out there. No. So you got to actually look. If you're going to bring the actual housing market down, there's going to be a lot of homes in negative equity, right? Or as they used to say, underwater. So the first challenge is to make sure the people in those homes can still afford, based on their mortgages, etc., can still afford those homes, right? The second challenge is to make sure the banks don't look at that collapse in equity and realise that means their assets are underwater too, and out of desperation start to mass foreclose on those homes to cover their own butts. They created this problem, but they have shown historically they would be absolutely prepared to throw millions of people out in the street to cover their own backsides, right? So what the Citizens Party would do is this: impose a foreclosure moratorium, so no one's family home can be foreclosed on. This does not cover investment properties because it can't. It's not up to the government to protect investments like that. But for your home, so we're trying to avoid social dislocation here. So it would make sure that doesn't happen. We would use the public bank, and if we were the government, we'd turn the Reserve Bank into the public bank. It is a government bank. You'd use the government bank to buy impaired mortgages off the banks at a discount though. So you would have a new market value for, just say they lent $1 million, right? But the homeowner can't afford the payments on $1 million anymore. Plus the equity has dropped because the value of the home is now, say, $600,000 or something. We'll use a more reasonable figure. So then, accountants can come along and say, well, the new market value of that mortgage is not $1 million anymore. It's $600,000. So the government bank can buy that mortgage off the private bank, give them a tax credit in exchange for them taking a haircut. And that's an important principle because up until now, the banks have had no risk in the housing market. They put the risk entirely on the borrowers, right? And that is wrong. That's another reason they've just poured the money into the system and pushed it up. They have to wear some of the risk here. Give them a tax credit to help with that because you don't want them to go under, and then restructure that loan so the homeowner can pay at the new rate. And then you're going to have to take the big banks especially, but all of them, through the equivalent of receivership and go through their books and do this at scale. This can be done. Now, some people will be saying, oh, you don't want to do that, but I can tell you now, we're always one, butterfly's breath away from a crash of the housing market, which is going to crash the banks anyway. If you don't believe it, if you're not old enough to remember 2008, go back and read up about it, right? We only dodged that because we got some bailouts that no one ever acknowledged. So this can be done, and it must be done to mean that side of the equation, the people who already own homes, there is a managed transition for them, right? And they're not thrown to the wolves. And we don't have economic chaos because of banks, just a cascading bank collapses everywhere. And then all this is through the use of the public bank. And then finally, Elisa, this is quite fundamental. You've got to look at the overall economy. And one of the real problems, the reason I call this a cancer, is because if you look at the GDP of Australia and all the different sectors, the biggest sector is financial services, and the second biggest sector has been real estate and construction. And it should never have been that way, right? We don't have manufacturing anymore. We don't have all these other, the productive sectors have shrunk. So we've got to use the public bank to shift the balance of investment away from the real estate sector. So it goes back to its main job of just providing shelter for people, right? That's its function, and reorient the economy back to a productive economy. And this is how the Chinese were able to deflate their bubble. They had a massive housing bubble as well, but as big as the Chinese housing bubble was, the industrial sector of China was much bigger. And so when the Chinese government a few years ago put in place policies to bring down house prices, they at the same time, they boosted even more the productive sector of China. And so from the standpoint of incomes, etc., the Chinese people weren't left devastated, and they've been able to have a fairly smooth transition. We could do the same thing here.
Yeah, they have a very well regulated and thoroughly regulated banking system to do what they have to do to protect the homeowners and things like that. But anyway, we will put a link below to the full article that you can read through the details, but also circulate this to other people so that they can see the pathway out of this disaster. Right, on to our next topic. The Liberals crying spies are the real traitors. Now, suddenly on the 28th of April, which was, I think, Monday. Anyway, Nine's The Age and Sydney Morning Herald came out with this article headlined "Group with Historical CCP Links," referring to the Chinese Communist Party, required Chinese Australians to vote for Ryan, and that's in reference to Monique Ryan, who's the MP for Kooyong over on in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. And it alleged that a Chinese community leader, Mr. Ji Jianmin, was directing campaign activity on behalf of Monique Ryan's campaign through his organisation, the Australian Hubei Association, of which he's the president. And the article included 2 videos showing 2 Chinese Australians who were handing out how to vote information at pre-polling booths for Ryan. One of them said in the video she was told to support Ryan, although ahead of that she had said she was told Ryan was very good, so it wasn't just, vote Ryan for no reason. It was, this is a good candidate, this is someone you should support. The other person said that they supported Ryan due to her policies. But nonetheless, the Nine media were able to construe this without providing any evidence whatsoever as being support of CCP-linked United Front work department groups getting behind the campaign of Monique Ryan, which, of course, last election took this seat away from the Liberal Party. And these are, in fact, desperate Liberal Party scare tactics to try to swing the seat back their way. Even though they had no evidence, the citations of, at least casting aspersion without evidence came from people from ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and other academics who were originally Liberal Party ministerial appointees to their positions.
Well, let me say something about that, because this is an exercise. This is a study in journalist tactics. People should look up these references in the media if you want to see what we're talking about, because they use things like phrases like historical ties to the CCP or accused of links to the CCP, right? Now, so we're talking about one organisation, the Australian Hubei Association, and Hubei is a province of China. So this is an association for Australian Chinese who live in Australia now, but historically their links go back to the Hubei province, right? And so they have an Australian Hubei Association. Now, this is so tenuous. This is the whole foundation of these accusations, whether this organisation is linked to the CCP through the Chinese government's United Front Work Department, which is its sort of soft power organisation, right? It's how it presents the friendliest face to the world. It's called the United Front Work Department. And funnily enough, the name United Front is actually a very positive name, because what country invaded us or tried to invade us in World War II? Was it China? No, it was Japan. And while it was trying to invade us, it did invade most of Asia. Do you know what country it invaded first? And raped and pillaged it in the most horrific way, killing 20 million people, was China. And the way the Chinese finally defeated the Japanese is the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party, the Communist Party of Mao Zedong and the Nationalist Party of Chiang Kai-shek, joined forces. And they called it the United Front. And once they joined forces, they were able to defeat the Japanese. So that's actually a positive name, historically a positive name. And because there's 8 political parties in China, not just one, there's one ruling party, but there's 8 political parties that all contribute to policy. When they say, they still use this name, United Front, and it's the United Front Work Department. And all it is presenting a friendly face of China to the world. But because the China haters, especially coming from America, have developed this from 2015 or so, this idea that China is a threat to them just because it's a bigger economy, they took the attitude is if anyone doesn't hate China like them, then they must be an agent of China, and they started demonising this united front. In Australia, they had an agent named Clive Hamilton, and Clive Hamilton, who is a supposedly left-wing academic, wrote an absolutely filthy, disgusting, vile book in 2018. I call it that because if anyone knows the history of Chinese in Australia going back 150 years, they copped some real abuses. But 150 years ago, there was the Lambing Flat massacre of Chinese. One of our political heroes was the Reverend Dr. John Dunmore Lang, who was one of the great Republican figures of Australia in the middle 19th century. He was one of the few political figures in Australia prepared to stand up for the Chinese, people who came here on the gold rushes, etc. And when he died, he had a big entourage of Chinese mourners at his funeral because he actually did stand up for them. But they were the victims of enormous racism. And if you don't accept that, you're the bigot. I'm sorry, it's a historical record. And the racism took this form, the yellow peril. That the hordes of Asia are going to come and take over Australia. And they had horrible cartoons about these Asians going to rape your women and take over the country and all that kind of stuff. So then this left-wing academic, Clive Hamilton, in 2018 wrote a book called Silent Invasion. And it was about the Chinese takeover of Australia silently.
Playing on all those fears. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this guy is a sanctimonious, up himself, left-wing academic. Scum, utter scum. If you're an Australian citizen who just happens to be Chinese, and because of garbage books like this, you get a suspicion on you, right? That's why I call these people scum, Elisa. Clive Hamilton is scum. And what he did was he wrote, even then, he's the authority on these organisations in Australia that are supposedly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. He made a submission to Parliament in 2018 with a co-author named Alex Josky, a young guy who was his researcher. Alex Josky, who was literally, I'm not exaggerating here, literally mentored by a CIA officer. This is how much these people are controlled by America. They made this submission to Parliament. It mentions this association 3 times, just 3 times. But listen to, so there was a big submission, mentioned lots and lots of organisation. I mentioned this one just 3 times, the Australian Hubei Association. Didn't single them out at all, just mentioned them as part of different groups. And then, but this is the most important quote in the submission. I'm going to read it out, we'll put it on the screen. This means that most pro-Beijing associations in Australia are not overt front organisations for the CCP, and since they also engage in innocuous social, cultural and business activities, it may be misleading to label them as solely United Front organisations. Like they had to, because they're making this garbage up, they had to include that caveat in their submission. It's there for the journalists to read, and the first journalist in the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald who wrote this garbage quoted their submission, but even though they're basically saying we don't have any evidence for this, they still use this formulation of accused of links to the CCP. And so now you've got, rearing its ugly head, people who are just as Australian as us. These are Australian citizens getting suspicion cast on them.
That's what really is disgusting because, I mean, we're really denigrating what it means to become an Australian citizen for people that we allow to immigrate here. And this brings up the case because the media coverage continued the next day. On the 29th of April, The Australian had an article which brought in another Australian Chinese. And this article was about Claire O'Neill's electorate, the Labor housing minister. So the headline there on the screen, Labor Minister Claire O'Neill rushes to axe Chinese polling booth recruits, because then it turned out that it wasn't just Monique Ryan's electorate, but in this electorate, an ALP, a long-time ALP member by the name of Chap Tao, had organised his association to provide assistance to her campaign. And of course, you know, these are long-term Australians. Mr. G, who was cited in the case of Monique Ryan, he made a statement saying, we are Australian citizens. We uphold Australian values. We serve and contribute to Australia. This is our responsibility and duty, you know, as good citizens. It's fulfilling our obligation as Australian citizens leads to Australian Chinese communities being maliciously distorted, slandered and defamed, then what justice is left? And in the case of this Mr. Chap Chow, I mean, he's been a member of the Labor Party for how long?
Well, since 2004, so 20 years.
So, and he put a statement out too, because the Australian covered this on the 30th of April. This is the headline: Chinese operative admits he has been helping Labor at elections for years. What do they want? No Australians of any heritage other than Australia to help their campaigns? I mean, what are they?
Well, hang on. Just be clear. No, just be clear. If no Australians of any heritage other than Australia means Aboriginals.
I know, exactly.
They want no Australians with any heritage other than Europe.
Maybe we shouldn't even vote for them. I mean,
we're not woke. The Citizens Party is not woke. But people, don't deny racism when you see it. It's too easy to be racist against Asians and Chinese people because they look different. At the heart of this is this assumption that Western Christian civilization is superior to the whole world, and even though China is its own 5,000-year-old civilization, it is inferior, the people are inferior, and we should somehow be afraid that Chinese Australians are participating in our system. There is an element here that is just racism, and that is what they want. They would love that, some of these people. Trust me. Senator James Patterson, who was the one who accused, who made the biggest threat, he made a threat against these Chinese people by saying they should be referred for an investigation under foreign interference. Well, foreign interference is a crime, and you go to jail for that. Right? That's actually a threat. He's a member of an association, I forget its name, it's like the Empire League or something, that was founded in 1910 in the UK, right, for people who around the world love the British Empire. Yeah. He's a member of that. He's so white, he's a member of that. And he's the one casting aspersions on Chinese Australians, right? But can I say, there's a particular contrast here. I want to play a video now of, in the time we've got left, just quickly, it's not a long one. Because on Sunday and Monday, Elisa, we met these people. We met the two people that have been in the media this week. We met, well, you didn't meet him. I met Mr. Chap Chow because I went to a candidates event that the Chinese community put on, and I was invited there to be one of the candidate representatives and speak to the audience. And on that evening, we had dinner at another event where Mr. Ji Jianmin was the host of the dinner, and then he came to our own event the next day as one of our guests, along with a lot of other Chinese people. And these people, when you meet them, they're very enthusiastic Australian citizens wanting to contribute to Australian political life. And why might they support, say, the Citizens Party or Monique Ryan? Well, Monique Ryan's not the one talking about war with China. The Liberals are, right? That's why. So, Mr. Chap Chow, but I just wanted to, they call this headline in The Australian, calling him a Chinese operative, which basically means Chinese agent, right? That's what The Australian called him. Well, bizarrely, at this candidates event, there was someone representing the Labor Party, someone representing the Liberal Party, someone representing the Fusion Party, someone representing the Greens, and me. And I was the only one who wasn't Chinese. And Mr. Chap Chow was there representing the Labor Party. And each representative spoke about their party's policies. I was the last speaker, and I set the cat among the pigeons because I made a big deal of saying our party's policy is to cancel AUKUS and have an independent foreign policy, which is not the Liberal Party's policy, of course, and not the Labor Party's policy. And the audience was really enthusiastic about what I said, and this led to a very intense discussion on foreign policy, and it put the two representatives of the two major parties on the defensive because they were there to defend their own party's position, which was clearly unpopular in the room, right? And so watch this video, this quickly. The man standing up, looking at me, is Mr. Chap Chow, and you might not make it out too well, but he's asking about what I said about AUKUS, because we've only got this little fragment of it, but because he's standing on his feet to defend AUKUS. Have a look.
So
Wait,
power
wait,
is a
but-
nuclear power.
Huh?
It's a nuclear
Nuclear
power.
power, not nuclear arms. You and I agree, but he's skeptical that this undertaking would be honored.
他们都知道了，
I
给
take
他
it,
给
take it.
给那个
He's
给
not.
立党讲他的
neighbours
policy
have。no grounds to believe us.
No grounds.
So that man is on his feet defending the Australia, UK, US partnership for nuclear submarines against me, the white guy, who said we should cancel it, and he's there to defend it because it's his party's policy, right? So, if anything, I'm the Chinese operative, he's the American operative. Those scummy racists in the Australian newspaper called him the Chinese operative. This is, now, by the way, Chap Chow is wrong to defend AUKUS. I'm happy to criticise Australian Chinese. He's just showing his loyalty, he's sticking to his party's position, right?
But his party's not loyal to him.
Absolutely, they've dropped him like a hot potato. These people are cowards. The only party that will defy this McCarthyism in Australia is the Citizens Party. McCarthyism can only be defied. Back when Joe McCarthy was running a reign of terror in America, so bad that the playwright who married Marilyn Monroe, what's his name? He wrote the Crucible, right? Arthur Miller. Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible about the Salem witch hunts in the 1600s as a metaphor for what Joe McCarthy was doing to Americans in the 1950s. And it was only when some brave people from Hollywood and the military finally just in those hearings, the House Un-American Activities hearings, stood up to him and one guy said, "Have you no shame?" That it broke his spell and it sort of broke the back of it, right? Because it took open defiance. But in Australia, the two major parties are cowed by this, and only the Citizens Party will stand up to this kind of McCarthyism. Because the people who are pushing it, like James Patterson, and we have to play this other clip as well, because this is how bad it gets. So it's gone from accused of Chinese links to Chinese operative to listen to what Senator Hume, Jane Hume, who we call the Senator for Bankers, said yesterday on Channel 7.
Let down by the Labor Party.
I thought
they feel
Peter
let
Dutton
down
didn't think
and
they were
worse
mature
off
enough
for the
to
last
understand
3
that they
years.
had to vote Liberal.
You don't need to go out that far on the polling booths, Claire. There might be Chinese spies that are, handing out for you.
Now, Elisa, that's a throwaway line, but Chinese spies on polling booths. From this story where I read you the quote earlier, they don't even have evidence. The people who conjured this up had to have a caveat saying we actually can't prove any of this.
Yep.
These are your fellow Australians people who just because they're Chinese looking and because we are on our knees to a power, namely the United States, that wants to pick a fight with China, their whole contribution to Australia is being called into question. This is unacceptable.
Yep. And you can read an article in this week's Alert Service too, where we are calling for AUKUS to be cancelled because it's that arrangement that puts our nation at risk.
Yep.
And to her credit, Monique Ryan is one of 3 independents who are demanding, at the very least, a parliamentary inquiry to revisit the terms of that arrangement and whether it's applicable and whether we should proceed with
And
it.
after this election, we're going to help push very hard for a Senate inquiry into AUKUS.
Exactly. So that's one key part of fighting against this top-down anti-China nonsense, because this is a nation we should be cooperating with, as well as our other large Asian neighbours that really provide a future pathway for Australia to develop itself in collaboration. So that's the show for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa. Oh, remember to
Don't
vote.
forget to vote ACP tomorrow.
Yep, you're watching this on Friday night. Vote Citizens Party in the Senate, wherever you are in Australia, except ACT, but we'll catch you next time.
And next week, we'll tell you what happens. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.